Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise tonight and have chosen not to attend the congressional baseball game because I think I have an important message which needs to be heard. And I rise to elevate an economic and humanitarian issue that is manifesting itself across Ohio, our nation, and our continent. Millions upon millions of workers, many landless workers essential to getting America's work done in agriculture and other sectors, live and toil in an eerie shadow existence. These workers often are exploited due to our broken immigration and legal systems, which afford them and their work no respect. Our beloved father, Stephen, would say, they are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. Let's take a peek inside who some of these workers really are. These workers dare to climb skyscrapers and install the steel beams and pour concrete across our country, one slip away from death. They embrace harsh work circumstances, going into the brutally hot sun in the south and west, picking your vegetables and fruits for 12 to 16 hours a day at high season. In our vast tobacco fields, they work from sunup to sundown, picking off flowers from tobacco plants in the blistering 110-degree heat as their fingers and hands numb from the nicotine, and their sweaty, sunburned bodies turn ripe for melanoma skin cancer. And they have no health insurance. They work in hot steam chambers cleaning our laundry in the big cities and in the very, very difficult environments of slaughterhouses using electricized cutting equipment, and they're covered in blood in those slaughterhouses for the meat that we eat. They trudge through manure in dairy farms, and they harvest mushrooms sold in every store, any grocery stores around this country, in cold, damp, dark, underground caves, walking through horse dung. They catch by hand thousands of chickens every night in the dark, hot coops that generally have 25,000 or more chickens each, where the stench and the dust are life-threatening. They clean bathrooms in amusement parks, along state turnpikes, and in airports. And why do they do this work? To survive, while holding out hope for a better life for them and their loved ones. Without these workers, our tables would be bereft of the food we depend upon. America could not feed itself. Without these workers, companies would have to pay higher wages and offer health insurance to do the work. Indeed, many, many, many millions of these workers are uprooted, actually continental labor refugees, spit out of vicious and violent economic and political systems across the Americas. Yet continental trade compacts like NAFTA and CAFTA were designed purposefully to create this landless class of laborers, to purposely undervalue them and their work. NAFTA caused millions of these workers to be upended and lose their small farmsteads in Mexico, precipitating the largest human exodus from the land in modern history, and reciprocally, in our country, millions of Americans lost their jobs in factories and farms across the nation as our jobs were shipped south. Trade agreements have failed workers on this continent in their homelands, and many of those south of our border fled to find ways to make a living, drawn by worker shortages in many countries, including our own, finding work in the most unappealing jobs our citizens won't take. Now, for those who came here to work, they face even more cruelty by the Trump administration and many members of this body too, as their children and families are being ripped apart. And I'm going to tell you a story about that in a second. News reports are beginning to reveal the edges of this ugly system of de facto human bondage. Our nation, founded in slavery, fought a bloody civil war over whether the economic system of the South would be extended west, and we have not completely healed from that war even until today. Sadly, American history has not been immune from subjugating and indenturing workers. This situation of penniless workers in bondage is the modern-day version of a continuing continental exploitation of labor. It is an old story, repeating itself in a new chapter. Last Tuesday, in a very well-known greenhouse operation in my district, in Erie County, Ohio, near Sandusky, the home of the roller coaster at Cedar Fair, this well-regarded greenhouse operation was raided at the height of this spring season by dozens and dozens and dozens of federal immigration, border patrol, and IRS officials. At least 114 male and female workers were detained, removed to jails, and are being questioned somewhere. But where? Those who are parents have been cruelly separated from their children with no provision made for the children. This is a photo, I'll say something about that in a second, of what was going on last week in Ohio. The reverberations of this raid in Ohio will be felt across a greenhouse and nursery industry at high season when these companies must have workers. They are highly dependent on thousands of seasonal laborers to perform the necessary work. And I'm talking just in Ohio, tens of thousands of workers. The same is true in our border state of Michigan. I worry about these workers, and I worry about whether these firms will find the workers to perform the work at such a key time of the year. There simply aren't enough hands left to do the work. Men and women workers, some of whom had worked for this firm for nearly 2 decades, were surrounded by ICE officers who came out of another state, Detroit, Michigan, heavily armed with rifles. They even tied the hands of citizens of our country behind their hands before questioning them. Border Patrol helicopters whirred overhead as workers were handcuffed and made to lie down on their bellies before being taken by bus to detention centers hundreds of miles from Erie County where this raid occurred. As far as I've been able to determine, the women workers, most of whom are mothers, have been placed in the Calhoun County Jail near Battle Creek, Michigan, and the men in a facility in Northeast Correctional Center in Youngstown, Ohio. I took particular note that Immigration and Customs Enforcement must have notified the Associated Press that took this picture of the impending raid as a reporter traveled all the way from Michigan to take this particular photo and report on the raid. But the same notification was not extended to the local press, nor for that matter, to local Ohio law enforcement officials who knew nothing about this raid. It certainly looks like the Trump administration seems intent on staging a big show on immigration. But where is its interest in real solutions? Was this raid really about security? Or is it more about intimidation? Or is it trying to divide Americans along economic and racial lines? I was told the greenhouse workers put up no resistance. They were peaceful. When I asked ICE if I could visit the workers in one of the detention centers this past weekend, I was told arrangements could not be made, even though these workers work in the district I represent. This is simply unacceptable. ICE, which reports to the superlords in the Trump administration responsible for this, have been over a day late and a dollar short in their answers back to us in their communications. Yet people's lives and their children's well-being are at stake. Stonewalling is simply not an option. So I intend to head to Michigan in a few days to try to find the detention center and hopefully speak to some of the women. I understand if I do so, we have to do it over a video phone or something. And I will say to the Department of Homeland Security, I expect a full report on the status of each of these workers, as well as evidence they are being treated with dignity and respect in the county jail. I hope to share more publicly about what I learned with my colleagues here in the House, as well as the people of Ohio's 9th District. I want a full effort and report on what is at issue with each of the persons apprehended. I want to know where each is located, as well as what can be done to minimize the trauma for their children being separated from their parents. So how did America get to a point where people who work hard with their hands for a living are rounded up like cattle, and their children taken from them to places they know not where? Some of these children may be dreamers, Americans who've grown up in the United States whose immigration status needs to be addressed. So let's do it. Today we learned that next week this House apparently will vote on two competing measures that relate to immigration. One is from Mr. Bob Goodlatte of Virginia, H.R. 4760, called Securing America's Future Act of 2018. That bill only gives temporary status to young people who've grown up in this country. It makes deep cuts to legal immigration. It prevents legal immigrants from sponsoring their family members to enter the United States, and of course it boosts enforcement. It is a punitive bill. It's really not a very hopeful bill. And even if it could pass this House, it's not going to pass the Senate. Then there is this mysterious new bill that Speaker Ryan calls a compromise bill. And the compromise bill we may vote on next week still isn't written, but it follows a framework, we're told, set forward by the White House: legal status for dreamers, increased border security, including funding for a wasteful, ineffective border wall, an end to the diversity visa lottery, and curbing family-based legal immigration. Wow, there's so many people who've come to our office who want to marry someone who's waiting in another country. How many decades are they going to have to wait? Just an hour ago, a summary provided said this: this second measure would authorize funding for construction of a border wall sought by President Trump and give a path for so-called DACA population to apply for a 6-year, indefinitely renewable, non-immigrant legal status, after which they can apply for newly allocated green cards. We'll see. Count me as a skeptic. To date, the Trump administration has failed to help young dreamers who have been here their whole lives. To date, the Republican congressional majority has failed to provide a pathway for these dreamers. The majority has failed to act on comprehensive immigration reform, which we really need. Years of inaction by House Republicans who hold the majority have brought us to this point. And we had a measure down here on the floor that had garnered 216 signatures to bring a set of votes to the floor that could really have addressed this problem, and the majority jerked it off the ledger the other day. Rather than blaming workers and harming U.S. companies, let's put the blame where it belongs, on the trade agreements that the United States has been passing since the 1990s that set us on a treacherous and greedy path of bad trade deals like NAFTA and CAFTA that threw millions of workers out of work in our country, and millions of workers and small businesses in countries like Mexico lost their work, treated like chattel on this continent. We need a renegotiated NAFTA. These bad deals have never resulted in a positive trade balance for our country. Instead, they displaced millions of workers in North America. U.S. plants shut down here, and trade deals like NAFTA thrust cheap labor into the market, forcing wages down across the continent, including in Mexico. Border crossings doubled into our country after NAFTA's passage, including illegal entries of desperate people under desperate circumstances. Those trade deals disrupted the markets that small farmers in Mexico and Central America relied on to support themselves. Who would not flee desperation? You would too if your livelihood disappeared. Think about it. The best estimates suggest 11 million undocumented immigrants have assumed some of the hardest, lowest-paying jobs inside our economy since NAFTA's passage and 10 years after that, CAFTA's passage. Employers and employees are transfixed by a rigged global economy that pits businesses and workers across this continent against one another. Who benefited from that? Ask yourself that question, answer the question. Many workers have endured long journeys by foot, train, boat, as labor traffickers indebted them to make it across our border. Others who work here simply stayed beyond the expiration of their temporary visitor permits. The situation is more complicated than many people realize. The reality is about 60% of the unauthorized population of workers here has been here for at least a decade. A third of undocumented immigrants, 15 years of age and older, live with at least one child who is a U.S. citizen by birth. So do we close our eyes to all of this and what has happened on this continent, or do we fix it? The renegotiation of NAFTA presents a precious moment, and I'm with the President on renegotiating NAFTA, but with what provisions? The chance to create a just economic model for all of North America that respects and recognizes both employer needs and labor rights should be in a trade agreement. Renegotiation could have a monumental impact on not only economic opportunity for millions, but also correct distorted migratory patterns and labor markets made so much worse by NAFTA. Instead of lifting up workers and improving their plight, achieving good jobs with living wages, the current NAFTA-CAFTA system forces workers into a harsh system that equates to a modern-day version, yes, of slavery. Workers understand that standing up and complaining about abusive conditions will mean termination, because an employer can report them to immigration authorities. So the guillotine always hangs over their head. A renegotiated NAFTA can bring workers out from under the shadows. It will benefit business, it will benefit workers, and it will benefit our communities and our continent. When workers are asked, why do they endure all this? Almost all have the same reason: survival and a hope for the American dream. For those that have come here from other places and work here, they're performing the jobs the rest of America chooses not to do. Rather than end this miserable underground system of indentured servitude, Republicans have chosen inaction time and time again. NAFTA and CAFTA need to be renegotiated to institute a legal system that gives workers standing in the law, not exploitation, whatever side of the border they live on. Now, Republican lawmakers fail to acknowledge the vast role American foreign policy has played in creating the conditions in North America that push and pull workers on their perilous trek, destabilizing their way of life. You cannot solve this problem without solving the NAFTA and CAFTA problem. Recall President Reagan worked with Congress to pass the last comprehensive immigration reform bill in the 1980s, and at the same time, Unfortunately, the United States government negotiated with international development institutions to develop new policies that favored large multinational corporations but undercut workers, including the smaller farms and businesses that created economic opportunity for communities in our country and south of our border. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, boy is that a misnomer, was sold to Congress as a way to keep Mexicans home and to make sure that American workers were cared for. Well, guess what? NAFTA actually threw millions of Americans out of work, and also millions of Mexican farmers and small businesses were displaced. These upended workers sought opportunity wherever they could find it. Indeed, immigration to the United States from Mexico doubled post-NAFTA as millions of U.S. citizens saw their jobs shipped south of the border, and those south of the border who couldn't even afford food at that point, a desperate exodus began, and people were willing to work for penny wages. A decade later, Congress passed CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, further undercutting agricultural workers and small entrepreneurs throughout the rest of the southern tip of North America. So these policies trapped Latin American workers between a foreign policy that drove them from home and a U.S. domestic policy that kept them in the shadows while driving good jobs out of the United States to low-wage environments. Ask yourself, who would benefit from that kind of system? Look at the profits of some of the companies and the CEOs of those companies that did that. We also know far too many employers take on undocumented workers and exploit them for their willingness to work long hours for no pay. President Trump, please know, walls will not solve these massive economic inequities our trade policies created. Only fixing NAFTA and CAFTA will. Our nation needs comprehensive, continental immigration reform that should include an e-verify employee system to take the onus off the employers to verify a worker's status and to give workers standing on this continent. No border wall can succeed against the enormous pull of our vast economy's needs, including for labor, as employers complain every day to me they cannot find the workers they need. Let me conclude